For 7 years, she called him worthless. Then she fired him in the middle of the office, in front of the entire floor, while her arrogant mother watched, and her new lover stood beside her with a cold smile. Pack up your desk. She had no idea that the man she had just humiliated was no lowly employee. He was the boss of an entire empire hidden in the shadows. And for 7 years, he was the one who had quietly kept her family's company from collapsing. He simply adjusted his cuff, gave a single nod, and walked away. If you have ever been looked down upon by the very people who should have valued you most, stay until the very end. Because what this man does with nothing but silence, and one cold glance across a glass table will sit in your chest long after the screen goes dark. And in a quiet corner of that building, a cleaning woman had watched it all unfold, the only person who had ever treated him like a human being. She had no idea that this night would change the course of her entire life. If this story moves you, leave a like to keep us going. Share it with someone who needs the reminder that their worth was never anyone else's to decide. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the stories still to come. The glass door closed behind him with a sound so faint it was almost as though it had never existed. And across the entire floor, people remained frozen in place, as if waiting for something that hadn't happened yet, waiting for the man who had just been humiliated to come back, slam his hand down on the table, shout something, beg or threaten, do anything a person who had just lost everything was expected to do. But Rourke Ashford did nothing. He walked along the gray carpeted corridor with the steady stride of a man who knew exactly where he was going, his shoulders never slumping, his chin never lowering, and it was that very calmness that made the people who had just laughed behind his back suddenly feel a faint chill crawl along their spines without understanding why. There was something wrong in the way this man was leaving, something their reason couldn't yet name but their instincts had already sensed, the way a small animal senses a coming storm before the sky has even begun to change color. He passed the reception desk and nodded to the young woman on duty, just as he had every morning for the past 7 years. And for reasons she couldn't explain, she nodded back with a respect that surprised even her. The elevator doors opened, swallowed him, then closed again, and only then did the floor behind him finally break into whispers and stolen glances toward the glass desk, where the woman who had struck the blow was still standing, the victorious smile not yet faded from her face. Down in the lobby, when Rourke stepped out of the building bearing the name Marrow in glittering gold letters, that fresh, gleaming gold concealing a company already rotting from within, the black car was waiting at the curb, and the man standing beside its door inclined his head slightly. Emmett had followed him for 12 years, long enough to read his employer's mood from the tension in a single shoulder, and what unsettled him now wasn't the fact that Rourke had just been fired, but his silence, a silence so dense it seemed to carry weight, with no orders, no word about what was to happen next, not even the smallest lift of his chin to signal the unseen people who were always waiting for his command in the shadows. Emmett had prepared himself for fury, for the cold instructions he was accustomed to hearing. But instead, Rourke merely adjusted the cufflink at his wrist, that insignificant gesture Emmett had witnessed hundreds of times. The gesture he knew meant this man was thinking far more deeply than anything he allowed the world to see. "Do you need me to call our people, sir?" Emmett asked in a low voice. Rourke simply shook his head. "Not yet," he replied, stepping into the back seat. It was in the moment he bent to enter that something small slipped from the breast pocket of his jacket without his noticing, falling onto the cold granite step with a delicate metallic chime before lying still beneath the morning sunlight, a small piece of dark gray metal engraved with markings that no ordinary office employee would have any reason to carry. The car pulled away and merged into the flow of Chicago traffic, carrying the man who had just allowed an entire floor of people to believe they had destroyed him, while the truth was so bitterly ironic that, had anyone spoken it aloud at that moment, no one would have believed it. And there, on the step, after the expensive shoes had disappeared and the morning noise had returned to its ordinary rhythm, a woman emerged from the side entrance reserved for service workers, still holding a damp cleaning cloth in one hand, her dark brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck, her hands roughened by years of labor. Mara Kowalski bent down to wipe away a streak of mud someone had left on the step, a task she had performed thousands of times until her hands knew what to do without thought, when her eyes suddenly caught the strange metallic glint resting between 2 stone slabs. She picked it up, wiped away the thin layer of dust with her thumb, and felt its weight settle into her palm, a weight more real, more solid than anything that should have belonged inside an ordinary office building. She didn't know what the engraved lines meant, and she didn't know why such a small object made her heart seem to slow for a single beat, but through the quiet instinct possessed by those who had spent their lives near the bottom, an instinct sharpened by countless moments of having to read other people in order to protect themselves, Mara knew one thing with absolute certainty. This object hadn't belonged to an ordinary man, and neither was the man who had dropped it. She closed her fingers tightly around the piece of metal and looked in the direction where the black car had vanished, and without understanding why, she slipped it into her pocket instead of turning it in to Lost and Found, as though some part of her had already known, from that very second, that this morning would never again be remembered as merely an ordinary morning. To understand why Mara Kowalski slipped that piece of metal into her pocket instead of letting it pass out of her life, one first had to know who she was during the hours when the entire city lay asleep, when the lights on the 16th floor went dark and the people in expensive suits had gone home to their families. Her shift was only beginning. She pushed a cart filled with cleaning cloths and bottles of disinfectant along the silent corridors, wiping away the traces of a day she had never been invited to take part in. Her hands had grown calloused many years ago, the thickened skin at the base of her fingers forming rings like those inside the trunk of a tree, each one marking another winter. She had survived through the strength of those hands alone, and around her neck, hidden beneath the faded fabric of her uniform, hung a delicate chain bearing an old silver ring, its engraved lines worn almost smooth from being rubbed again and again by the fingers of another woman long before Mara was born. It had belonged to her grandmother, Helena, and Mara hadn't taken it off since the night it was placed in her palm. She didn't remove it when she slept, didn't remove it when she bathed, and wouldn't remove it for anyone. Inside the building called Marrow, where most people passed one another without ever troubling themselves to remember the face of the person who cleaned up after them, Mara was a shadow, and she had long ago learned how to live as a shadow while still keeping one part of herself beyond anyone else's reach. Yet there was one person in that building who had seen her, truly seen her, and it was the man everyone called Rory. Throughout the months he had worked at the desk, tucked away at the far end of the floor, he was the only one who ever looked up when she passed, the only one who called her by name instead of merely lifting his chin to summon her. And on the nights when he stayed late with stacks of papers rising high before him, she was the one who quietly set a warm cup of coffee beside him, not because anyone had told her to do it, but because she recognized in the stillness of the way he sat a loneliness that looked exactly like her own. He always thanked her, always in that low, gentle voice that made the words sound sincere, and in a world where no one had ever thanked Mara for anything, those small moments were things she preserved, the way people preserve warmth through a long winter. That was why, earlier that morning, as she stood hidden behind the glass wall and watched them gather around to humiliate him, she had felt something tighten inside her chest, a slow, burning anger she had no right to speak aloud. But if anyone understood what it was like to be treated as though she didn't exist, it was Mara, because only the night before, she had tasted that feeling once again. That evening, while she was cleaning the large mirror in the executive waiting area, Diane Vance had stepped out of the elevator beside another woman, wearing an expensive cream-colored coat and a cold strand of pearls around her neck, and she had passed Mara as though passing a chair, a potted plant, a piece of furniture placed there to serve rather than to be seen. She didn't shout at Mara, or lower her voice to scold her. She did something colder than anger. She spoke about Mara while standing directly in front of her, turning to the other woman and remarking that it was difficult to find decent cleaning help these days, that people like this were paid to remain invisible, not to stand around awkwardly blocking the way, and both women laughed softly, a laugh so light it almost sounded graceful, before walking away, without looking back even once. Mara lowered her head and continued polishing the mirror, her hands moving in the same familiar circles, and from the outside, she looked no different from a quiet woman obediently accepting her place in the world. But in that mirror, had Diane looked closely enough, she might have seen Mara's eyes, eyes that hadn't lowered with her head, calm and fathomless eyes silently taking note of everything, not with hatred, but with the steady clarity of a woman who knew exactly where her worth came from, and who knew with absolute certainty that such worth had never been, and would never be, something for people like Diane to decide. A woman doesn't possess that kind of calmness in her eyes, unless she carries within her a story both long and heavy. And Mara's story began far from this cold glass building, in an aging working-class neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, inside a cramped ground-floor apartment where winter crept through the cracks around the windows, but never once found its way into the heart of the woman who raised her. Her mother left when Mara was only 6, leaving her in the care of her grandmother Helena. And Helena never spoke a single bitter word about the daughter who had walked away. She simply tied a faded apron around her little granddaughter's waist and said, "Come here, child. Let me show you how to make something decent out of whatever is left behind." That was the entire faith upon which their little home had been built, to make something decent out of whatever remained. And Helena lived every day of her life according to those words. She took in mending from people throughout the neighborhood, her hands never resting and never growing greedy, and those skillful fingers could transform a worn and fraying dress into something almost new, could turn scraps of fabric other people had thrown away into little dolls for her granddaughter to play with on afternoons when there was no money for toys. Mara could still remember that tiny kitchen on winter evenings as clearly as if she were standing inside it now. She remembered the warm yellow light falling across the stained walls, the smell of potato soup bubbling softly on the stove, and the way her grandmother would set a steaming bowl before her and say that their possessions might be few, but love must always be given in abundance. The two of them would sit at that unsteady wooden table, eating and laughing until their small room rang with joy over some wandering story Helena had told, and their laughter was warm enough to melt the cold knocking at the door outside. It was at that same wooden table that Helena taught Mara how to hold a needle, how to guide each stitch so it would lie straight and even. And on one such evening, while the stove crackled softly in the darkness, she removed the old silver ring from her finger, the ring whose engraved letters had been worn almost completely away, placed it in Mara's small palm, and gently folded the child's fingers around it. "This ring has followed me through more winters than I can count," she said. "It isn't beautiful, and it isn't grand. It only does its quiet work where no one ever applauds, but it endures. It never breaks. And you must remember this, my child. A woman builds her worth with patient hands in the darkness, where there is no audience at all, and no one in this world, no one, has the right to stand above you and decide how much you are worth. That number has never belonged to them to determine." Mara was too young then to understand the full meaning of those words, but from that night forward, she wore the ring on a chain around her neck and never took it off again. Those warm years passed the way all beautiful things seem to pass, too quickly and too easily, and when Helena grew old, when her memories began leaving her one piece at a time and her body became frail, Mara was the one who stayed. She was the one who gave up every dream of her own to sit beside her grandmother's bed through each long night, the one who carried the mounting medical bills until they swallowed every dollar she earned and then began swallowing the money she hadn't even earned yet, leaving a debt upon her shoulders that she was still paying to this day. Helena passed away on a quiet spring morning, holding her granddaughter's hand until her final breath, and Mara was left alone in the world with a crushing debt and a silver ring worn nearly smooth. There had also been a time when Mara believed she had found another home, another man, another promise. But that home had turned out to be a place where she wasn't safe, a place where she had to live in fear and make herself smaller than the woman she truly was, until one day she finally understood that there are some homes a person must leave because walking away is the only way to survive. So she left, carrying nothing but the strength of her own two empty hands and her grandmother's ring. Now, whenever her hands ached after a long night shift, whenever the contempt of others threatened to push her beneath the truth of her own worth, she would raise a hand to touch the worn silver resting over her heart and hear her grandmother's voice traveling back to her through the years, reminding her that no one had the right to decide how much she was worth. And that ring, the only possession she had managed to keep, had become the talisman that reminded her who she was during the darkest hours of her life. But an old debt and a worn ring weren't the only burdens pressing down on Mara's shoulders in those days, because only a few days after the morning when Rory had been humiliated on the 16th floor, a new threat arrived. And this time it wasn't aimed at her alone, but at every invisible person who worked beside her in the darkness. That afternoon, when the night cleaning crew gathered in the cramped little basement room, where they stored their carts and changed into their uniforms, a man none of them had ever seen before came down the stairs. A man dressed in a gray suit tailored perfectly to every seam, with a composed face and a courteous smile so polished that it made people feel more uneasy than reassured. His name was Sloane Merrick, the man whom rumors throughout the building called the new strategic advisor, someone brought in to restructure the company, and he stood there among those tired people in their faded uniforms, speaking to them in a smooth voice and wrapping his meaning in elegant words about efficiency, optimization, and the company's need to streamline its operations in order to survive this difficult period. He didn't say outright that they were about to lose their jobs. Men like him never said anything outright. He simply let those polished words fall into the room like cold stones, leaving each person to understand for themselves that the fragile ground beneath their feet was about to be taken away. Mara stood at the back of the room, silent as always, but her eyes moved across the faces around her, and she could see the fear written plainly upon them. She saw Rosa, a woman past 50, whose legs had swollen from so many years of standing, a woman whose entire family on the other side of the city depended on every small paycheck she brought home, and Mara saw Rosa's hands tighten around the hem of her uniform, the hands of a woman silently calculating what would happen to her grandchildren if she lost this job. To the people in that room, this quiet cleaning work wasn't something small. It was the roof over their heads, the food on their tables, the only support keeping them from falling into a pit where nothing remained below to catch them. And Sloane, with his smile and his beautiful words, was preparing to pull that support away as casually as someone removing a card from a game, without troubling to look down and see who would fall. When he finished speaking and went back upstairs, leaving behind a room submerged in heavy silence, Mara watched Rosa approach her, and the older woman merely took Mara's hand in hers without managing to say a word. It was in that trembling grip that Mara understood that this time she couldn't simply lower her head and continue quietly onward as she always had. This was no longer only about her. It was no longer another insult she could swallow and then force herself to forget. This was the fate of the people who had shared pieces of bread with her during their breaks, the people who had become the closest thing to a family she still had in this world, and that thought awakened something inside her that she had believed buried long ago, a quiet but enduring resistance. The same resistance Helena had planted within her when Mara was still a child sitting beside the fire. That night, after her shift ended and she returned to her small rented room, Mara took from her pocket the object she had kept hidden for the past several days, the small piece of dark gray metal that the man named Rory had dropped on the stone steps. She placed it beneath the light, turned it between her calloused fingers, and traced the intricate engraved lines whose meaning she couldn't begin to understand, while a question continued to grow inside her mind, a question that made the image of the quiet employee seated at the desk at the far end of the floor seem less convincing with every passing moment. The man who had always thanked her in that deep, warm voice, the man who had allowed an entire floor to believe they had destroyed him without uttering a single word of protest, the man who carried in his pocket an object no ordinary person would ever have reason to possess. Who, Mara began to wonder, was that man really? The question Mara was asking herself in that small rented room that night had an answer she could never have imagined. An answer that, had someone spoken it directly to her face at that moment, would have made her shake her head and dismiss it as some impossible tale, because the man everyone inside the Marrow building knew as Rory Nash, the quiet employee who had spent the past several months sitting at the desk at the far end of the floor, had never truly been Rory Nash at all. That name was only a garment he had wrapped around himself, fashioned with the same care and precision one might use to sew a suit meant to conceal the scars beneath it, and the real man hidden behind that disguise bore a name that, in the shadowed corners of Chicago, people dared speak only in whispers. Rourke Ashford, head of the Ashford family, the crime boss who held an entire empire in the darkness within his grasp. That empire had no name displayed on any gleaming golden sign, and appeared in no corporate directory, yet it existed everywhere people failed to see it, in the ports along the lakeshore where cargo moved according to laws of its own, in the quiet streams of money passing through dozens of front companies, and in the careful silence of those who understood that some names were best left unspoken. Rourke had inherited that empire in a way no child should ever have to inherit anything. He had grown up beneath its merciless rules, learning to survive in a world where trust was a luxury and weakness could cost a person their life. And by the time he took the highest seat, he had become a man whose single cold glance was enough to silence even the hardest among them. Yet somewhere deep within that powerful man, something had never completely died, a quiet longing to live another kind of life, a life in which he could wake each morning without wondering who would try to destroy him that day, a life with an ordinary home, with a woman who could look at him and see a human being instead of a crime boss, an honest life he had promised himself he would one day claim no matter what it cost him. And 7 years earlier, he had believed he had found the door leading to that life when he met Celeste Vance. He had approached her not as a crime boss, but under the false name Rory Nash, an ordinary man with an ordinary job, and he had deliberately hidden everything from her, hidden his power, hidden his empire, hidden the world that had shaped him, because he wanted someone to love him for the bare and unguarded man he truly was, not for everything he possessed. He married her with an almost desperate faith that this love would become the rope that pulled him out of the darkness. That if he lived long enough inside the skin of an honest man, then perhaps one day he would truly become one. That perhaps even a man like him had the right to begin again, to abandon the empire that had bound him, and step into the light as someone ordinary. That was the promise he carried for 7 years. The promise that kept him sitting silently at the desk at the far end of the floor, and enduring his wife calling him useless. The promise that made him lower his head and accept insults that, in his other world, would have forced the speaker to pay a terrible price for even one of them. He had believed, with a naivety almost heartbreaking in a man who had seen as much as he had, that as long as he preserved that disguise, as long as he refused to reach for his power, the honest life he desired would remain within his grasp. It was because of that promise that he had bound his own hands and blinded himself to signs that his instincts as a crime boss should have recognized long ago. And it was because of that same promise that, on the morning they fired him, he had merely adjusted his cufflink and walked away. Because in that moment, one part of him was still clinging to the dream of the man he had spent 7 years trying to become, and he wasn't yet ready to admit that the dream was now shattering beneath his feet. But that dream of an honest life wasn't something Rourke merely sat and imagined before allowing it to fade away on its own. Because throughout those 7 long years, he had quietly been doing something no one in the Vance family had ever suspected. Something that, had they known about it on the morning they gathered around to humiliate him, would have frozen the triumphant smiles on their faces into expressions of terror. Marrow, the company bearing his wife's family name, in glittering gold letters across the main lobby. The company Diane Vance proudly regarded as her family's inherited legacy, would in truth have died many years earlier if an invisible hand hadn't quietly kept it from collapsing. There had been seasons when the trucks sat motionless in the yard because there was no money left to pay for fuel. Months when creditors were prepared to descend upon the company and seize every last asset. Moments when one small push would have been enough to bring the Vance family's paper empire crashing down, taking with it all the pride they wore around themselves like a fine garment. And every time, at the very moment when escape seemed impossible, something had always happened. A profitable transportation contract would suddenly appear from nowhere. A mysterious investment would arrive at precisely the right time to fill the empty space. An aggressive creditor would unexpectedly soften his voice and withdraw without explanation. And the Vance family accepted every one of those miracles as though they were only natural, as though fortune had always been destined to favor people of their noble blood. Not one of them ever stopped to wonder why luck came to them with such remarkable regularity. Not one of them thought to follow the invisible threads leading back to the source of those miracles, because, had they done so, they would have discovered that every one of them began with the same man. The quiet man seated at the desk at the far end of the floor whom they continued to call useless. Rourke had used his front companies, the hidden connections he had built over many years, and the full weight of the Ashford name he kept concealed to bring Marrow contracts it should never have been able to reach, to quietly pour into it the streams of money that kept it breathing, and he had done all of it without leaving behind a single trace that could lead back to him. Not because he wanted recognition, but because he wanted the exact opposite. Because he never wanted anyone to know. That was the tragedy buried deep within him. Because even while saving his wife's family company, he still insisted on keeping that part of his life clean, completely separated from the dark world over which he ruled. He had imposed upon himself a rule so strict it bordered on stubbornness, that he would never use his intelligence network to investigate his wife, would never plant informants inside her family's company, would never allow the suspicious instincts of a crime boss to touch the home he longed to preserve as something pure, because in his mind, doing so would have been no different from staining the very thing he was struggling to protect. He wanted to trust his wife, as an ordinary husband trusted his wife. He wanted to enter his home without carrying that distrustful man inside with him, and he believed that as long as he maintained that boundary, his honest life would remain untouched. But the blind spot he had deliberately created, the dark place he willingly refused to illuminate because of love and because of a promise he had made to himself, became the opening through which the conspiracy quietly entered and grew directly beneath his eyes without his ever realizing it. While he closed his eyes in order to keep his home clean, other hands were silently hollowing it out from within, and that willing blindness born from the heart, something that should have been the most beautiful expression of trust, became the very weapon his enemies used against him. And so, on that fateful morning, when Celeste pointed at him and ordered him to clear his desk and leave, the cruel irony was that the man the entire Vance family had just driven away with such satisfaction was the same man who had quietly kept them alive for 7 years, the invisible hand that had prevented them from falling into the abyss. And they had severed their own lifeline while believing they had merely cast away a burden. On the night after he was fired, Rourke didn't return to the magnificent mansion where the underworld knew him, but instead went back to the modest little apartment he still rented under the name Rory Nash, the apartment that belonged to the man he had spent 7 years trying to become, and perhaps for some reason even he couldn't explain. He wanted to remain inside that life a little longer tonight before he was forced to shed it. The building stood on a quiet corner, where pale yellow streetlights spilled across the worn concrete steps, and after the car dropped him off and quietly pulled away at the small nod he gave Emmett, Rourke walked toward the entrance and suddenly stopped, because on the steps leading to the door, a solitary figure sat waiting in the darkness. He recognized her immediately. She was the cleaning woman from the Marrow building, the woman who had always quietly placed those late cups of coffee beside him, and she had just lifted her eyes toward him, perhaps equally surprised to discover that they lived in the same building, even though they had never once crossed paths outside working hours. Mara, looking slightly embarrassed, began to rise and move aside, but Rourke merely shook his head and sat down a short distance from her on those very steps. And for a long while, they remained there together in silence, two people whom the daylight world passed without ever troubling to notice, now sharing the stillness of the night. She was the first to speak, quietly asking whether he was all right after what had happened that morning, and he was slightly taken aback, not by the question itself, but by the way she asked it. There was no intrusive curiosity, no pity, only the simple and sincere concern of someone who understood what it meant to be trampled by life. He told her he was fine, then, after a brief pause, surprised even himself, by adding that sometimes a person had to lose something before they could clearly see how much it had truly been worth, and Mara only nodded softly, because those words touched something she had understood deeply for a very long time in her own life. They spoke sparingly, in short sentences separated by long silences. Yet it was the kind of conversation in which every spoken word carried weight, the kind that could exist only between two people who had both grown accustomed to swallowing the things they could never tell anyone else. Then Mara reached into the pocket of her coat, drew out a small object, and held it toward him beneath the streetlight. "I think this belongs to you," she said softly. "You dropped it on the steps of the building that morning." Rourke lowered his gaze to the calloused palm held open before him, and when his eyes fell upon the dark gray piece of metal resting there, his entire body grew slightly rigid. It was something no one outside his world was ever supposed to see, an emblem whose meaning was understood only by those who stood at the deepest level of his shadow empire, something that, had it fallen into the hands of an outsider, should have been dismissed as a meaningless scrap of metal and either thrown away or turned in to lost and found. Yet this cleaning woman hadn't merely kept it safe for several days. She had recognized that it wasn't ordinary and had carefully carried it with her so she could return it directly to him. He lifted his eyes and studied her for a long moment, truly seeing her for the first time, not as a silent shadow moving through the building, but as a human being, and within the calm, unfathomable depths of her gaze, he recognized something he hadn't encountered in anyone for a very long time, a quiet perceptiveness, an ability to see beneath the surface that belonged only to those whom life had taught through costly lessons. He reached out and took the object from her, his fingers brushing lightly against her calloused palm, and thanked her in that familiar deep, warm voice. But this time there was something different within those two simple words, a genuine respect. As for Mara, when she saw the way he had gone still at the sight of the metal, she became even more certain of the instinct that had followed her for the past several days, that the man sitting beside her wasn't nearly as simple as his quiet appearance suggested, and in that silent moment on the steps, both of them sensed the same truth, that the person seated beside them wasn't the ordinary soul the world believed them to be, and from that unspoken recognition, a quiet respect began to take root between two invisible people. The instinct that had told Mara to keep the quiet man's piece of metal wasn't the first time her silent intuition had spoken to her, because not long before that night on the steps, the same feeling had led her to preserve something else, something whose value she couldn't possibly understand at the time, but which would later become the link that changed everything. It happened during an ordinary night shift like any other, as Mara pushed her cart through the executive offices, an area that was now completely deserted except for the faint hum of computers that hadn't been fully shut down. She stopped beside the paper shredder in the corner of Sloane Merrick's office, a machine that had been acting up and jamming repeatedly for the past several days. And just as she had feared, it was jammed again. A stack of papers had been shoved into it too hastily, clogging the blades inside and causing the machine to howl before choking to a stop halfway through. Mara bent down and, with the practiced movements of someone who had done this many times before, began pulling out the paper caught inside so she could clear the machine, and while removing the crumpled scraps, her fingers touched a small leather-bound notebook that had been pushed all the way to the bottom. Someone had clearly tried to force it into the shredder to destroy it, but the broken machine hadn't managed to swallow it completely. It had only chewed through one corner of the cover before becoming stuck. Under ordinary circumstances, a cleaning woman would simply have picked up the notebook, placed it back on the desk, or thrown it into the trash before continuing with her work, and at first, Mara intended to do exactly that. She lifted the notebook, brushed the scraps of paper from its cover, and planned to leave it neatly on the desk so its owner could recover it in the morning. But something made her stop, the instinct sharpened by all the years she had spent near the bottom of life. The instinct that always knew when something was wrong even before reason could give it a name. No one shoved an intact notebook into a paper shredder in the middle of the night unless they wanted it erased from existence. People destroyed only the things they desperately needed to disappear, things whose continued existence posed a danger. And the hurried way this notebook had been forced beneath all the other pages told her that it wasn't an ordinary notebook. She quickly turned through several pages beneath the dim light and saw that they were crowded with numbers, abbreviated names, and lines of notes written in symbols she couldn't understand. But it was precisely their incomprehensibility that made the warning inside her grow louder. She didn't know what the notebook recorded, how valuable it might be, or how dangerous it was. She knew only one thing. Someone had wanted it gone very badly, and survival had taught her that the things people took reckless measures to destroy were often the very things worth preserving. And so, instead of placing it on the desk, Mara quietly hid the notebook beneath her uniform, finished clearing the shredder until no trace remained, then pushed her cart onward as though nothing had happened, carrying with her a secret she didn't even know she possessed. But when she slipped that notebook inside her clothing, she had no idea that she wasn't entirely alone in the deserted office. At the far end of the corridor, where the lights had faded to a faint glow, a young man named Darius was still sitting at his desk, a junior secretary who often remained late to finish the mountain of work others placed upon his shoulders. And through the narrow opening of a partly closed door, he had accidentally seen the cleaning woman retrieve something from the paper shredder and conceal it on her person. Darius said nothing and didn't call out to her. He simply stored the image quietly in one corner of his mind, the way a person remembers something when it touches a suspicion that has already been smoldering inside them. During the mud-experiencing the months he had worked under Sloan, Darius had gradually begun to notice that something wasn't right about the records he was assigned to process. The numbers didn't match. Strange expenses vanished only to reappear beneath different names, and whenever he happened to ask about certain transactions, he was met with a cold smile and a carefully worded reminder that there were some matters one would be wiser not to question. And now, after seeing the cleaning woman quietly rescue something from Sloane's own paper shredder, the suspicion smoldering within the young secretary suddenly flared into something unmistakable, and he began watching the advisor's every movement more carefully than ever before. In the days following that night on the steps, Emmett came to see Rourke many times, and each time he carried the same question, one he didn't dare speak aloud but that his eyes asked for him. How much longer would his boss wait before making his move? He had served Rourke long enough to know that this prolonged silence was unnatural, that with a single word from him, the entire empire in the shadows would begin to move, and those who had dared humiliate him would finally understand whose path they had crossed. Emmett couldn't comprehend why the powerful man he had followed for so many years continued to sit still and endure it all like someone ordinary. "You only have to say the word, sir," Emmett said through clenched teeth one evening. "Everything will be finished in a single night." But Rourke merely gazed out the window in silence, while inside him raged a conflict Emmett could never fully understand. Retaliation wasn't merely a matter of issuing an order. Retaliation meant tearing down the curtain, allowing his true self to step into the light. And it also meant that the woman who had quietly brought him coffee, the woman who had sat beside him on the steps and looked at him as though he were simply a man, would have to see the other man, the crime boss concealed beneath the skin of Rory Nash, and he didn't know whether he could endure the moment when her calm gaze turned to fear. For 7 years, he had longed for someone to look at him as an ordinary human being, and now, with bitter irony, the only person who still saw him that way was the very person before whom he would soon have to reveal the truth. But Mara had already begun moving toward that truth on her own before he could decide what to do. One evening, when the two of them happened to meet again in the small courtyard outside their building, Mara stood silently watching him for a long while, then began to speak, slowly and calmly, laying out everything she had quietly pieced together in her mind over the past several days. She spoke of the piece of metal no ordinary office worker would have any reason to carry, of the way he had walked out of the building that morning, without breaking down as anyone else might have, of the man who was always waiting beside the black car with the eyes of a guard rather than a driver, of Rourke's strangely unshakable composure. The kind of composure life had taught her belonged only to people who possessed far more power than they allowed the world to see. She said all of this without interrogation or accusation, only in the steady voice of someone calmly giving a name to a truth she had already recognized. And when she finished, she lifted her eyes to meet his directly and asked him who he truly was. Rourke stood beneath the streetlight, and for one long moment, he could have denied it. He could have invented an explanation. He could have continued wearing the disguise he had protected for 7 years. But as he looked into the deep, unwavering eyes of the woman before him, he understood that lying to her now would be an insult to the very insight that had allowed her to see through him, and so he didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it in words. He simply remained silent, but it was a silence heavy with meaning, and within it, Mara found everything she needed to know. What surprised him most, what softened some hidden corner of his heart that he had believed hardened long ago, was that she didn't run, she didn't step back, didn't panic, and didn't look at him with the horror he had feared seeing in her eyes for days. She only nodded faintly, as though confirming something she had already known deep within herself. And then she told him about the notebook, about the object she had rescued from Sloane's paper shredder, about the numbers and symbols she couldn't understand but instinctively knew were important. And it was there, beneath the faded yellow glow of a streetlight on a quiet corner, that an unlikely alliance was formed between two people the world still regarded as invisible. One, a cleaning woman who knew every dark corner of the building and the secrets people believed they had thrown away. The other, a crime boss who possessed enough power and cunning to turn those scattered pieces into a counterattack. And both of them understood that from that moment forward, their fates had become bound together. When Rourke brought the notebook home and began tracing the numbers and symbols crowded across its pages with Emmett, what gradually emerged before him sent a chill down the spine even of a man who had survived every kind of scheme the underworld could devise, because the conspiracy unfolding beneath his own roof wasn't nearly as simple as he had believed, and the person behind it wasn't the one he had suspected. For days, he had remained convinced that Celeste was the true mastermind, that his wife, driven by greed and contempt, had orchestrated everything to cast him aside, and that Sloane Merrick was merely the lover she had brought into the company, a parasite, a puppet in her hands. But the pages of that notebook told an entirely different story, one that overturned everything he had believed. Sloane wasn't anyone's puppet. He was the hidden hand pulling every string. Behind the polished disguise of a courteous strategic advisor, he was an operative for a rival family, a power in the shadows that had long hungered to swallow the Ashford territory whole. And he hadn't entered Marrow by chance, but as part of a plan calculated with cold precision down to every move. His objective had 2 layers. The first was to seize control of Marrow itself and turn it into a shell through which his family could cleanse its streams of dirty money. The second, infinitely more dangerous layer, was to use that position as a foothold from which he could search, probe, and uncover the secret threads linking Marrow to the vast empire in the shadows that he suspected was concealed somewhere very close. And what chilled Rourke most, once he fitted every piece together, was that Sloane's suspicion had been correct. With the sharpened instinct of a predator, Sloane had sensed early on that something wasn't right about the quiet man named Rory Nash who sat at the far end of the floor. He couldn't identify anything specific, and had no evidence. But the intuition of a man accustomed to hunting in darkness had warned him that Rory wasn't as simple as his submissive appearance suggested, that beneath that strange composure might be a threat which, if allowed to awaken, would reduce his entire plan to ashes. So Sloane had struck first. He had carefully arranged to remove that man from the board as quickly as possible, using Celeste and the contempt already festering inside her as his instruments, feeding that contempt until it blazed, then staging the public and humiliating dismissal, not merely to disgrace Rourke, but to drive him out of the building and sever him from everything before he could understand what was truly happening and respond. The morning the entire Vance family believed they were throwing away a burden had actually been a move calculated by Sloane to clear the path for a far greater conspiracy. And in the cruelest irony of the entire game, The person who believed she held the power to decide everything was the one being used most completely. Celeste, for all her cleverness and ambition, had always believed she was in control, that she alone had decided the fate of her useless husband, and that Sloane was a man so consumed by desire for her that he would do anything she asked. She had no idea she was only a pawn on his board, a convenient tool he controlled by skillfully exploiting her greed and vanity, a puppet who imagined herself the one pulling the strings. He had courted her not out of love, but because of her position within the Vance family and the access she could give him. And once he had extracted everything he needed, once the company rested securely in his hands, Celeste's fate would be no different in his eyes from that of the notebook he had shoved into the paper shredder, something whose usefulness had ended and therefore needed to disappear. When Rourke finally understood the entire picture, he sat in silence for a long time, because he realized that this game was far larger and more dangerous than a betrayal within a family, that the enemy he faced wasn't an unfaithful wife, but an entire power preparing to devour everything he had built, and that the cleaning woman carrying that notebook had unknowingly placed in his hands the one missing piece capable of overturning the whole board. There was one thing neither Rourke nor Mara knew during those days when they quietly stood beside one another, fitting together each fragment of the conspiracy, something that, had it been revealed, would surely have left them both stunned. Their paths had crossed once before, many years earlier, on a night Mara had tried to bury so deeply within her memory that she almost never dared touch it again. It was the worst night of her life, the night she decided to leave the home where she had never been safe, the home where she had lived by shrinking herself into someone smaller than the woman she truly was. And when she walked through that door with nothing in her hands, she carried not only fear but also a debt the man she was leaving had placed upon her shoulders. Shadowy loans he had taken out in her name, drawing the attention of men who collected such money in the darkness of the city. That night, as she stood alone on a bitterly cold street with no home to return to and not a single dollar in her pocket, the debt collectors found her and cornered her in a dark place where no one would hear her cries, and at the most desperate moment of her life, something unexpected happened. A man stepped out of the shadows, someone whose face she didn't have time to see clearly. She caught only the impression of a tall, composed figure and a faint scar running along his jaw when the streetlight passed across it, and the man spoke only a few words to the others, quiet words she couldn't make out, yet the aggressive debt collectors who had surrounded her moments earlier suddenly went pale, lowered their heads, and silently withdrew as though they had just realized they had reached for something far beyond them. The man took nothing from her, demanded no gratitude, and offered no explanation of who he was. He simply made the debt hanging over her disappear, removed the burden that had driven her to the edge, and opened a door through which she could move forward without being pursued by that darkness forever. Then he turned and walked back into the night, leaving her standing there in stunned disbelief, and she never saw him again, never learned his name, and as the years passed, that night slowly faded in her memory like a dream suspended somewhere between reality and illusion. A strange act of kindness from a stranger she believed she would never meet again. She could no longer remember the man's face, retaining only the faint impression of a calm, imposing figure and a scar along his jaw, and she had never understood why a stranger would choose to save someone as unknown and insignificant as she was. But the man had always remembered her. Rourke had never forgotten that night, never forgotten the image of the woman cornered in the darkness, who still held her head high and refused to kneel and beg, the strange calmness in her eyes even in the depths of despair, the quiet dignity that not even fear had been able to extinguish. That night, he had only happened to be passing by, only happened to hear what was taking place, and he had intervened not because of any calculation, but because something about that woman had touched the piece of humanity still alive within him, the part that an entire lifetime spent in darkness hadn't managed to kill. He had quietly erased the debt, quietly ordered those men never to touch her again, then walked away without leaving behind his name, and he too had believed he would never see that woman again. Yet now, after all those years, as he sat beside the cleaning woman who had returned his piece of metal and rescued the fateful notebook, he gradually began to recognize, in a gesture, a glance, something deeply familiar in the way she lifted her head, that the woman now standing shoulder to shoulder with him, against an entire power in the shadows, was none other than the same woman he had saved on that stormy night so many years ago. And the destiny that had bound these two invisible souls together had roots reaching far deeper than either of them had ever dared imagine. During the nights that followed, the small apartment rented under the name Rory Nash became the place where two invisible people quietly prepared their final move. And beneath the pale yellow glow of a desk lamp, Rourke and Mara bent over the leather-bound notebook with its torn corner, connecting each number, each symbol, and each abbreviated name with the things her perceptive eyes had silently observed throughout the many months she had spent working in the darkness of the building. She told him about the nights when she had seen Sloane staying alone in his office long after everyone else had left, about the discreet meetings with strangers, whom she had caught only fleeting glimpses of while pushing her cart past them, about the rooms she was normally permitted to enter and clean but which had suddenly begun to remain locked during certain hours, and every observation that had once seemed small and insignificant, when placed beside the entries in the notebook, fit together with terrifying precision, gradually revealing the entire path taken by the dirty money, and every hidden thread connecting Sloane to the rival family standing behind him. Rourke, with the mind of a man accustomed to solving games in which lives hung in the balance, immediately understood the value of what they now held, but he also knew that it still wasn't enough, that to bring down a man as cunning as Sloane, he needed one more link, someone on the inside who could verify those numbers and show exactly where they matched the company's official records. And that missing link came to them on its own. After many nights spent wrestling with the suspicions smoldering inside him, Darius, the young secretary, finally sought out Mara, the woman he had once accidentally seen rescuing something from the paper shredder. He told her that he knew something terribly wrong was happening, that he had grown sick of being forced to close his eyes to dishonest numbers, and that if someone was willing to stand up and expose the truth, he wanted to play his part. Mara brought him to Rourke, and inside that small apartment, the young man chose to stand with them, bringing access to the official financial records that neither Rourke nor Mara could reach, the final piece that transformed their suspicions into evidence no one could deny. But darkness never truly sleeps, and Sloane, with the sharpened instincts of a predator, had begun to sense that something was wrong. He noticed eyes lingering on him longer than usual, noticed that Darius had suddenly become guarded and evasive, noticed an undercurrent of tension in the air around him that his instincts couldn't ignore, and he began to suspect that something, somewhere, had begun to leak. He had people follow them discreetly, tightened control over the rooms, and one night, while Mara was pushing her cart alone through the deserted executive corridor, he blocked her path. He didn't shout or threaten her openly. Men like him never did. He merely stood in her way, wearing that familiar cold and courteous smile, and in his smoothest voice, he made seemingly casual remarks about how easily people could lose their jobs these days, about cleaning workers who became too curious about matters that didn't concern them, and then suddenly disappeared from the city without anyone caring enough to ask what had happened. And as he spoke, he stepped closer, near enough for the threat beneath his polished manners to become unmistakably clear. Mara remained still, her heart pounding, but she didn't reveal even the smallest trace of fear. She raised her head and looked directly into his eyes with the same calm gaze that had once remained forever in the memory of a crime boss, and she answered in an even voice that she was only a cleaning woman, that she knew nothing beyond the work she had been hired to do. But even as she lied, the quiet dignity in her eyes made Sloane hesitate for a moment, because he was accustomed to intimidating people who knew how to fear, and the woman before him refused to lower her head. Just as the tension reached its highest point, a tall figure appeared at the far end of the corridor, and Emmett, whom Rourke had assigned to protect her discreetly from a distance, approached with a deadly composure that forced Sloane to step back. He narrowed his eyes and studied the two of them for a long moment, then offered a strained smile and walked away, but the look in his eyes as he turned made it clear that he knew the game had entered a new and dangerous turn. That night, when Rourke learned what had happened, he asked Mara whether she wanted to withdraw from all this danger, telling her that he could take her somewhere safe, but she only shook her head, raised a hand to touch the silver ring at her throat, and told him that she had spent enough of her life running away, that this time she was choosing to stay, not only for herself, but for Rosa and for all the invisible people who would be crushed if no one dared to stand up. The suspicion that had been smoldering inside, Sloane finally turned into genuine panic on the night he discovered that the leather-bound notebook he had believed safely destroyed long ago had never vanished from the world at all. The truth began to surface when one of his men, planted inside the accounting department, hurried to report that Darius had quietly withdrawn copies of official records he should have had no reason to touch, and when Sloane connected that fact with the night he had cornered the cleaning woman in the corridor, with the tall shadow of the man who had stepped forward to protect her, he understood with a sudden chill that someone had obtained enough evidence to bring his entire plan crashing down, and that the person who had set everything in motion was none other than the woman he had once dismissed as a harmless piece of furniture. Anger and fear blended together until he began acting with greater haste than usual. And that night, after most of the building had fallen into darkness and only the cleaning crew remained quietly working on the upper floors, Sloane ordered his men to lock the main elevators and personally led several of them through the building in search of Mara, determined to recover the notebook and silence the woman who had dared interfere in his game. Mara sensed that something was wrong the moment the corridor lights suddenly dimmed and unfamiliar footsteps echoed from the stairwell, and the instinct for survival sharpened by years of darkness immediately began screaming inside her. She abandoned her cart and quietly made her way through passages known only to someone who had cleaned every forgotten corner of the building, through service corridors, rarely used fire escapes, and hidden spaces the building plans themselves hardly bothered to mark. She moved through the darkness like a true shadow, her heart pounding yet her mind remaining strangely clear. While behind her, the footsteps of those pursuing her drew closer, and then faded again as she led them deeper into the maze. At one point, she found herself trapped in a dead-end corridor, the emergency lights washing the walls in a pale red glow, and Sloane and his men appeared at the opposite end, his polished mask of courtesy now completely gone, leaving only the cold cruelty of a man driven into a corner. But at the very moment when there seemed to be nowhere left to run, the emergency door behind Mara burst open, and a strong hand pulled her back into safety. Emmett was there, standing between her and the men, hunting her with the deadly calm of someone who knew exactly what he was capable of doing. The confrontation unfolded swiftly and decisively in that narrow space. There were collisions and clean, controlled strikes when Sloane's men rushed forward, but Emmett and Rourke's people arrived at precisely the right moment and completely overwhelmed them without allowing the scene to descend into bloody chaos, because these were men who acted with the discipline of those who did only what was necessary and stopped the instant it was done. Then, amid the tense silence that followed, a figure stepped slowly from the darkness at the far end of the corridor, calm and unhurried, and when the red light passed across the faint scar along his jaw, Sloane went still. The man walking toward him wasn't the submissive employee named Rory Nash whom he believed he had removed from the board. He was someone else entirely. Someone carrying a cold authority that only those who had heard whispers of forbidden names in the darkness could recognize. In that moment, Sloane understood the terrible truth. For days, he had congratulated himself on defeating an insignificant man, when in reality he had provoked the very power his entire family had been taught to fear, and the man he had mistaken for prey was the crime boss he had been planted inside Marrow to find. Rourke didn't say much. He simply stood there and looked at him with cold, gray eyes, and that silence was more terrifying than any threat, enough to make Sloane understand that the positions between them had completely reversed. Sloane and his men were forced to retreat that night, but both sides knew this wasn't the end, only the opening note of what was still to come. And when Rourke led Mara safely out of the building, her hands were still trembling but her eyes burned with a new resolve. He told her quietly that every piece was now in its proper place, that the time had come for him to return to that building, no longer hidden in darkness, but in full daylight, and turn every card face up before all those who had underestimated him. The board meeting was convened on a morning when no one in the room, except for exactly 3 people, knew that it would become the fateful morning that overturned everything. Inside the vast conference room, with its glass wall overlooking the entire city, Marrow's board members sat around the long, gleaming table. Diane Vance occupied the place of honor, the familiar strand of pearls resting against her throat and the imposing air of a woman utterly convinced that power remained in her hands. Celeste sat beside her mother wearing the self-satisfied smile of someone who believed the game had already been decided in her favor, while Sloane stood at the far end of the room, his face tense beneath its carefully composed mask, because among all those gathered there, he alone had begun to sense what was coming. Then the conference room door opened, and the man the entire building had once known as the useless employee named Rory Nash walked inside, but this time there was no trace of the submissive figure who had sat at the desk at the far end of the floor. He entered wearing a perfectly tailored dark suit, moving with the stride of a man who owned the very ground beneath his feet, and behind him came Emmett and several other silent figures whose presence alone was enough to make the air in the room grow heavy. Celeste frowned and opened her mouth, ready to make some cutting remark about a man who had already been fired yet still had the nerve to show his face. But before she could speak, one of the older board members, a silver-haired man, who had spent enough years navigating the city's business world to know which names were never spoken lightly, suddenly rose from his chair with a bloodless face, and in a voice shaken by disbelief, he uttered the true name of the man who had just entered. Ashford. The name fell into the room like a stone striking the surface of a silent lake. And in a single moment, every smug expression around the table changed. Because even those who had never met Rourke had heard the Ashford name whispered with caution in conversations where voices were always lowered. Rourke didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't strike the table or shout. He simply walked to the head of the long table and placed the leather-bound notebook with its torn corner beside a stack of documents upon the polished glass. Then, in a deep and steady voice cold enough to send a chill through the room, began stripping away the conspiracy layer by layer before them all. He explained how dirty money had been funneled through the company, how false contracts had been created, and how Sloane Merrick had been planted there by a rival family with two purposes: to seize control of Marrow and to uncover the secrets hidden behind it. Every word Rourke spoke was supported by a page of undeniable evidence, figures matching the official records Darius had quietly obtained down to the smallest detail, connections assembled so tightly that no one in the room could offer a single argument against them. Celeste sat motionless as the truth revealed that the man she had despised and betrayed wasn't useless, that the lover she believed had been serving her had actually used her as a pawn and intended to discard her the moment his work was complete, and her face turned deathly pale when she realized that she had lost everything within only a few brief minutes. But the person whose collapse was most visible in that moment was Diane Vance, the woman who had spent her entire life taking pride in the supposed nobility of her bloodline, the woman who had walked past Mara as though passing a piece of furniture, the woman who had contemptuously dismissed her son-in-law as an insignificant nobody, now sat speechless, her ring-covered hand trembling against her pearls as she understood that the man she had looked down upon for 7 years was, in truth, a crime boss, more powerful than anything she had ever dared imagine, and, with even crueler irony, the very man who had quietly kept the company she cherished from collapsing. All the pride she had spent a lifetime building shattered in silence, and she couldn't force a single word from her lips. Then, in the midst of that moment when power was changing hands, the conference room door opened once more, and Mara entered, the cleaning woman who had once been treated as invisible inside that very building, the woman who had lowered her head and polished a mirror while others spoke of her as though she were an object, now walked into the boardroom with an upright posture and a calm gaze, no longer wearing her faded uniform, but carrying herself as a human being who stood equal to every person seated around that table. She was the one who had saved the fateful notebook. Her perceptive eyes had seen what every one of them had overlooked, and when she came forward to stand beside Rourke, the entire room suddenly understood that the person they had once regarded as the lowest among them was the very person who had held the key capable of bringing everything down. And within the calmness of her eyes echoed the words of a woman who had spoken beside a fire many years before, that no one in this world had the right to decide how much she was worth. This world has always longed for a perfectly tidy ending, one in which the wicked fall neatly into place, and the righteous emerge from tragedy without carrying a single wound, but real life rarely agrees to tie such a beautiful ribbon for us, and this story won't pretend that it has. For even as power was changing hands inside the boardroom, when it seemed that the mastermind had nowhere left to retreat, Sloane Merrick didn't collapse in the way everyone expected. He stood there amid the evidence exposing his crimes, and instead of panicking, a thin smile slowly appeared on his lips, believing he still held one final card hidden inside his sleeve. He began to speak, his voice as smooth and cold as ever, saying that Rourke might have won the game inside that room, but a collection of leaked files regarding the Ashford family's secrets had already been set to expose automatically if anything happened to him. It was the ruthless final move of a desperate man, but Sloane had severely underestimated the man standing before him. As he turned to walk away with a triumphant smirk, Emmett stepped calmly into the room holding a laptop, accompanied by officers from the Financial Crimes Division. Rourke's intelligence network had intercepted the third-party server and wiped the leaked files hours before the meeting had even begun. The smile froze on Sloane's face as the cold reality set in. He had walked directly into a net that had been quietly tightening around him for days. The police stepped forward, presenting a warrant for corporate espionage, money laundering, and fraud. The man who believed he was pulling the strings was led away in handcuffs before the entire board, stripped of his stolen wealth, and left with nothing but the shadow of his own failure. Celeste didn't go to prison, but what she lost was no less crushing than a sentence. She lost everything: the company, the status she had once displayed with such arrogance, and most bitterly of all, the illusion that she had ever controlled the man she believed she understood. She was left to continue living inside the empty shell of a life that had once seemed magnificent. And every night she had to sleep beside the tormenting truth that the man she had despised, betrayed, and thrown away like something old and worthless was in fact a man who had loved her deeply enough to hide an entire empire simply because he wanted to live beside her as an ordinary person. And throughout 7 years, she had never truly looked at him even once. The regret of losing something one once held in one's own hands but never knew how to value is a prison without bars. Yet it confines a person more tightly than any sentence ever could. And Diane Vance, the woman who had spent her entire life worshipping only social standing and the admiration of others, collapsed in the very place to which she had devoted everything. The story of her family spread through drawing rooms and high society faster than any truth, and the woman who had once passed others as though they were objects finally tasted what it meant to have an entire world turn its back and render her invisible. Rourke had reclaimed everything that belonged to him, the company now cleansed of every traitor, the power that had never truly left his hands, and the position no one would ever dare look down upon again. But when the smoke of battle finally cleared, and he stood alone at the center of his untouched empire, he understood that some things had been broken beyond the power of victory to repair. He had recovered everything except the one thing he had desired more than power throughout those 7 years. The belief that a man like him could leave the darkness behind, live an honest life, and be loved for the person he truly was. That dream now remained behind him like a scar, one he carried in silence, because he had come to understand a bitter truth, that the mask he had created to protect that dream was the very thing that had suffocated it, that when he concealed his true self in order to be loved, the love he received could only be love given to a shadow, and a home built upon secrets, no matter how beautiful it appeared, could never stand forever. He had paid the price for 7 years spent living behind a disguise, and that price was that he could no longer place his trust in others as easily as he once had. Whenever someone came close to him, he found himself wondering whether they saw the man he truly was, or only the things he possessed. But if there was one person who had come into his life without ever asking anything of his power, it was the cleaning woman who had returned the piece of metal he had dropped on the steps that morning. And after everything that had happened, Mara never desired a fairy tale transformation. She remained grounded in her quiet truth, a woman whose rough hands had cleared a path through the dark, wearing her grandmother's silver ring not as a relic of pain, but as a crown of unspoken strength. And when Rourke offered to repay her, to give her the comfortable life she deserved, she shook her head, because what she had longed for had never been wealth for herself alone. What she wanted to build was something greater, and it grew from the lesson Helena had taught her so many years before, to make something decent from whatever remained. With Rourke's quiet support he offered not as charity bestowed from above, but as one person placing his faith in something he believed was right. Mara built a service cooperative, a place where people who had spent their lives being invisible, as she once had, cleaners and others who worked in the darkness while the world passed without troubling to see them, could finally become the owners of their own work and their own destinies. Rosa, the woman who had once gripped Mara's hand in fear of losing her job, now stood with tears shining in her eyes as, for the first time in her life, she was called an owner instead of a shadow. And the people who had once lived in fear while waiting for the day they would be dismissed now walked with their heads held high upon their own 2 feet. Mara didn't build that place to take revenge upon anyone, nor did she build it to prove anything to those who had once despised her. She built it because she understood better than anyone what it felt like to be treated as though she didn't exist, and she wanted to create a place where no one would ever be forced to endure that feeling again. And between her and Rourke, the bond that had first taken root on those steps beneath the night sky now grew slowly and quietly, without display, without haste, and unlike any glittering love story people were accustomed to telling, it was a feeling built upon a rare foundation they both cherished, the genuine respect between 2 people whom the world had once dismissed, but who had never allowed that dismissal to decide their worth. They didn't need beautiful vows, and they didn't need to rush to give a name to what was growing between them. They were simply 2 people who had finally found someone capable of seeing them exactly as they truly were, and for 2 souls who had spent so many years living unseen, being truly seen by one person was more precious than all the splendor the world could ever offer. Many months later, on a peaceful evening when the lights of Chicago had begun to glow and the noise of the day had finally grown quiet, Mara could be found sitting silently beside the window of her small room, her calloused hands gently turning the old silver ring between her fingers, the ring that had followed her through every winter of her life. Outside, The cooperative she had built was growing stronger with each passing day, and people who had once been invisible now had a firm place beneath the sun. Rosa often told her that she had given them not only work, but also the dignity they had believed lost long ago. Yet in this quiet moment, Mara wasn't thinking about those achievements. She simply sat there and listened within her heart to the voice of her grandmother Helena traveling back across the years, as clear as though she were still sitting beside the fire in that small kitchen from long ago, repeating the lesson she had planted inside Mara when she was still a child, that a woman builds her worth with patient hands in the darkness, where there is no audience, and that no one in this world has the right to decide how much she is worth. Now, Mara finally understood those words completely. In a way the 11-year-old child she had once been could never have understood them. The ring in her hands concealed no secret and opened the door to no greater story. It was simply what it had always been. A small object without grandeur or noise, doing its quiet work where no one offered applause, yet enduring and never breaking, just like the woman who had given it to her, and just like the woman Mara herself had become. If there is one thing worth carrying away from this story, let it be this: that a person's true worth is always built quietly and slowly, during the hours when no one is watching, and that worth is never something for the arrogant or the impatient to decide. Those who call you small are only confessing how limited their own vision is. They are telling you how far their eyes can see, not saying anything about how far you are capable of going. A quiet person isn't an empty house, but a home that holds the deed of ownership tightly within its own heart, with lights still glowing in rooms where others have never been invited to enter. If Mara's story has touched something in your heart today, then before you leave, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who may need to be reminded that their worth has never belonged to anyone else to determine. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so that every day we can continue listening together to many more meaningful and captivating stories. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, what emotions it awakened inside you, and the most honest thoughts from the depths of your heart. So please leave a few words in the comments below and allow us to listen and share that moment with you. And if this story found you exactly where you are sitting and reached your heart, please leave us just 2 words: "I'm seen," so we'll know that you stayed here with us until the very final lines. Thank you for listening to the entire story today, and before we say goodbye, we wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, safety, and peace throughout every passing day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next story.